Here's the lecture for the 3.3 notes on human impact and biodiversity. We have 3 learning goals associated with this lesson. The first is to explain in general how human activities are reducing biodiversity. Second, explain how logging and fires reduce forest ecosystem biodiversity. And then third, explain how human activities are reducing aquatic biodiversity, in particular in the ocean. Well, let's first look at, in general, human activities. But in order to understand the drastic impact we're having on biodiversity, it's important to understand why biodiversity is important to us. First, the many organisms on our planet provide ecosystem or ecological services for us. For example, plants replenish oxygen, bacteria help to recycle nutrients in the soil, among other things. But even more important, or maybe not more important, but just as important as those ecological services are the economic services that nature provides for us in the form of the growth of food, the growth of lumber for building, paper, and even medicines that are found in nature for us. So biodiversity is important to us, and it is even of value, a significant value to us economically. So then why are we seeing a decrease in biodiversity despite it being so important to us? Well, the number one cause of biodiversity loss is habitat loss, which is the conversion of habitable area into some sort of urbanized system, whether it be a development for homes, a building, even parking lots, and even converting these areas into agricultural fields. Another reason for a loss of biodiversity is habitat fragmentation. Not quite as bad as habitat loss, but it still has a profound effect because this is where large ecosystems are divided into smaller ecosystems, hence fragmented by developments, roadways, agricultural fields, even the logging industry. Invasive species are also a major cause of biodiversity depletion. And this is because invasive species are able to outcompete native species for resources. And they have no natural predators of their own, so they kind of grow uncontrolled in ecosystems. One of the major examples we have of this in the United States is the presence of the lionfish, or the introduction of the lionfish to waters off the East Coast. It has no natural predators here, nothing can eat it, and it is outcompeting many of the larger fish in the ecosystem. And it is taking over many of our waters all the way down to the Florida Keys and all the way up as far as New York. So it's quite a massive problem that we're dealing with the lionfish. Extinction, of course, is the end result of loss of biodiversity. And biodiversity is a result of species going extinct. And of course, there's biological extinction, which is the worst form of extinction because this is where species can no longer be found in any ecosystem on Earth. There are other lesser forms of extinction, such as commercial extinction, which is not the complete wiping out of the species, but it basically is when, for example, a fish species is overfished to the point where it's no longer of value. It's so hard to catch, there's no market for it. There's also local extinction, where a species may no longer exist in a local habitat. Now, as far as extinction is concerned, we have different ratings for organisms depending on their risk of extinction. I'm sure you've heard of an endangered species. Well, that term specifically describes any organism that is at an extreme risk of becoming extinct over some or all of their natural habitats. A lesser rating is a threatened species. They're not at extreme risk of becoming extinct, but they could potentially become that way or become endangered in the near future. One example we have of this rating system is the bald eagle. The bald eagle used to be an endangered species, and therefore it received protection, and it no longer is endangered, it is now threatened because its numbers are starting to come back. It is recovering. And part of the reason why species like the bald eagle, and another success story is the gray whale, is because of the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This helps to identify and protect any endangered organisms and prohibits their destruction or their over-harvesting and also their destruction of their essential habitat or their breeding breeding grounds. So the United States Endangered Species Act focuses more here in the United States. There are international treaties, such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Also, the acronym is CITES. So this is a ban on the selling, hunting, capturing of any threatened or endangered species. I believe it is something like 172 countries have agreed to this treaty, but it has its limitations because those countries have different viewpoints on how much this should be enforced. Well, now we're going to focus on our forest ecosystems. If you recall, this was the second learning goal. Forest ecosystems are important to us because of high biodiversity. They release oxygen and are storage. They are sinks, you could say, for carbon dioxide. They reduce soil erosion. They recycle nutrients for us, especially the temperate forests that lose their leaves every fall. They influence climate and provide lumber and paper for us. So forest ecosystems are very valuable for us. Now, there are two general types of forests, and this is what we have been looking at in our lab, or are starting to look at in our forest plot analysis lab. The one forest that we are going to look at is an old growth forest. And this is a forest that has not been modified by human activity or natural disasters in the past 200 years. So this would be like our North Carolina plot. That is up in the Smoky Mountains. It's a protected forest. It has not been disturbed in quite some time. A secondary growth forest forms from secondary succession because the land was cleared due to some disturbance. And this could be from the logging industry, a forest fire, or some sort of storm. So if we look at those two pictures at the bottom, which is which? Well, the one on the left that you can see has a lot of biodiversity is an old growth forest. That is a great example of an old growth forest. Over on the right, if you notice, all the trees are pretty much uniform and there's not much undergrowth. That is a good example of a secondary growth forest. So what are the threats to forest ecosystems? The number one threat is deforestation from logging practices. The worst form of logging is called clear cutting. This is removing all the trees in an area at one time. And as it says there, it causes the most damage. Often, to help areas recover from clear cutting, tree plantations will be formed, which is where a land is commercially maintained for timber resources. They usually have low biodiversity because you're just planting one species of tree and growing it, and then cutting it down. And that usually ends up robbing the nutrients out of soil. So the soil usually has very poor nutritive value. Some better versions of foresting would be selective cutting, only removing mature trees and letting the small ones there to grow. This keeps the soil in better condition, and it also keeps the habitat there. Probably the best form of logging would be strip cutting, and this is removing a strip of trees along the contour of the land, as you can see pictured here. This prevents erosion and promotes quick regrowth of trees. So it's the best of both worlds. You're getting a good number of trees for lumber and paper, but you are still not destroying the habitat. You're allowing it to regrow quickly. Forest fires are also a big threat to forest ecosystems. And there are a few different types of forest fires. We have surface fires, which burn only the leaf litter. And these are actually good because they promote growth of seedlings and replenish nutrients. Crown fires are the ones you hear about in the news because they burn the tops of trees and spread very easily, and they decrease biodiversity because they can be out of control. Often we do not allow enough surface fires to clear out the brush. We often will try to put them out because we're concerned of them spreading and destroying homes. So the problem is that all the leaf litter and underbrush overgrows, becomes extra flammable, and when that burns, it often leads to crown fires. So that's why you often will see controlled burns or prescribed fires used as a way to help prevent these crown fires. You burn away the leaf litter and underbrush so you're not going to have as many forest fires, or large forest fires, I should say. The Forest Restoration Act is another act to take note of. And this act was passed to allow timber companies to thin forests that are at risk of fires. Some forests are simply just overgrown, and they need to be thinned out to lower the fire risk. Climate change is another threat to forest ecosystems because of the increased risk from insects. As climates change, insects can migrate, and their populations can increase faster, and they have a greater effect on forests, and as well as disease, such as Dutch elm disease, which of course infects elms to quite a degree in North America. So what are solutions to these problems? Well, one solution is to use strip cutting rather than clear cutting. Protect old growth forests, such as the Smoky Mountain National Park that protects that old growth forest and preserves it. Of course, and that helps to protect the biodiversity within it. Certify any timber that is sold in Home Depot or any other kind of like Lowe's store as grown sustainably. So basically, consumers would then have the option to only buy lumber or timber that has been used with strip cutting rather than clear cutting practices. Subsidize sustainable logging practices. This is the first time this word subsidization comes up. And this is where the government uses tax revenue to promote or help companies to do things sustainably. So it does cost the taxpayers money, but it promotes and conserves the biodiversity that also gives us money in return due to the economic value of the resources. And also any forests that have been clear cut should be rehabilitated, help them to grow back, go through their successional stages to become old growth forests again. Well, now let's change our scope here and take a look at grassland ecosystems. Their importance are very similar to the to forests, except they're usually used specifically for cropland because the soils are very fertile. There's lots of grasses for livestock to graze. So a lot of cattle are grown in rangelands, which are wide open and not restricted by fences. But then you also have pastures, which are fenced areas and maintained by rangers. The threats that grasslands, what threatens grassland ecosystems would be overgrazing. And this is simply when there's too many cattle, too many livestock, exceeding the carrying capacity of the rangeland or the pasture. And this causes erosion because the grass is no longer there to hold the soil, and it decreases the soil's ability to hold water because the animals are compacting it, and therefore not as much water makes it into the soil nor into the aquifers. We'll talk about the Dust Bowl in the future, but that was a lot of that had to do with overgrazing and poor agricultural practices. Solutions are to use prescribed fires to eliminate competing plants and replenish nutrients, and use rotational grazing, where if you have pastures, you rotate the cattle to different areas to prevent them overgrazing in any one particular area. So you're allowing the ungrazed portions to grow back and recover. Now we're going to switch to aquatic diversity and looking at the threats. The number one threats would be overharvesting. Many commercial fish stocks are overfished and declining. In fact, I think the recent number would be 90% of all species in the ocean are commercially overfished. Not extinct, but they are losing their value and not easy to catch anymore. One other way we overharvest many species is by or through bycatch, which is when a fishery that may be targeting swordfish, for example, may unintentionally kill non-target species such as tuna or dolphin or sea turtles. And this has a negative impact on biodiversity in the ocean. Pollution affects the ocean quite a bit. And most people don't realize that most ocean pollution comes from land activities. Runoff that includes sediments from building houses and construction, fertilizers from our lawns and agricultural practices, pesticides, industrial solvents, plastics, excessive nutrients, among other things. They've even found that birth control is actually residue from birth control being used by women actually influences the gender and sexual cycles of fish out in the ocean. So it's very crazy how our behavior on land impacts the ocean. Climate change also threatens aquatic diversity because rising sea levels destroy reef habitat, because reefs need relatively shallow water. So if the sea level rises, then you are decreasing the amount of light that actually reaches the corals, and they struggle with that. Mangrove forests also become flooded, and they need to be in shallow water as well. Melting ice, of course, in the Arctic affects polar bear habitats. They rely on the sheet ice to hunt seals. Well, if the sheet ice melts too much, their hunting grounds are disappearing. So that's why we see polar bears migrating onto the Arctic tundra, rather than they're hunting there rather than hunting out on the sheet ice. Invasive species also are a problem in I already mentioned the lionfish. That's a good example. And these are usually introduced through ballast water on ships. Ballast water is the water that a boat takes in once it leaves harbor. These large freighters and cargo ships actually intentionally sink a little bit to increase their stability. Well, then they get rid of that water before they go into a harbor in another part of the world. So that water may be carrying larvae or small animals from other parts of the world. So this is how the lionfish most likely got introduced into the east coast of the United States. Solutions to these problems include practicing sustainable fishing that reduces bycatch. If you notice, when you go to the beach, you see large shrimping vessels off the coast. They have these big booms that stick out to the side with large nets. Well, those nets actually are required to have trap doors in them for sea turtles. So if a sea turtle were to swim into that net, it has a way to get out of the net as well. That helps to reduce bycatch quite a bit. Set catch limits so that we do not overfish. Filter ballast water rather than just emptying it. Filter it of contents, making sure no organisms that shouldn't be in that ecosystem are released. Establish marine sanctuaries, essentially like aquatic parks that protect biodiversity within it. Also reduce carbon emissions to reduce climate change, and that would hopefully help to stymie sea level rise. Another solution that has been proven effective is the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. This prohibits the harassing, hunting, or killing of any marine mammals within U.S. waters. And this includes any bycatch. So if you ever pick up a can of tuna, you often will see that there is a dolphin safe label on it. That was brought to us by the Marine Mammal Protection Act because it encouraged fisheries to avoid fishing for certain species of tuna that have a symbiotic relationship with dolphin. So it reduces the bycatch of dolphin in tuna nets. The gray whale is another great example. Because the gray whale is always swimming up around California, we can protect it under the jurisdiction of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So a lot of these species have been able to recover because of this act. All right, revisiting our learning goals. So the first thing you want to be able to do for test time is to define habitat loss, fragmentation, and invasive species. Understand what those three things are. Then secondly, contrast endangered and threatened species. And then put those two things together for step 3 and explain how human activities are reducing biodiversity. The number one thing would be habitat loss, and also through building roads and such, fragmenting habitats, and introducing invasive species. All of those things really reduce biodiversity. And then summarize the Endangered Species Act and cities. That acronym is misspelled there for number 4. Okay, number 2. The first step is to contrast old growth and secondary growth forests. Old growth have not been disturbed for 200 years. Secondary growth are recovering from disturbances. Describe different logging practices, such as clear cutting, which is the worst, and then also strip cutting, which is much better and helps to promote the growth of regrowth of forests. And explain how logging and fires are both reducing forest biodiversity. And then finally, propose ways to sustain forest diversity. And lastly, focusing on the ocean, define bycatch, which is fish that are unintentionally caught and wasted. Identify sources of pollution in the ocean, which most of it comes from land. It can include fertilizers that cause eutrophication. It can include all sorts of solvents, insecticides, and things of that nature. Now explain how human activities such as pollution and bycatch are reducing aquatic biodiversity. And then finally propose ways to sustain aquatic biodiversity.